In this video, we're going to add 3 methods to our ArrayBag class. I'm going to add these methods to ArrayBag. They actually would work just as well in resizableArrayBag. The methods are not going to change how we add things to an array or really rely on the size of an array, and that's what makes those 2 classes different from each other. So really the code I'm giving for ArrayBag could just as well be put into resizableArrayBag. So the first method we're going to add is a third way to remove an element from a bag. Remember, we have one that just removes any old entry, we don't know which one, from the bag. We have a remove method that you specify an entry and it removes that one specified entry from the bag. And now we're going to add a method to remove a random entry from the bag. So the remove method that doesn't take any parameters, because it's not specified which entry is being removed, this one could remove a random entry from the bag. But since we already have that method implementing to remove the last entry of the array, we're going to add a new method. And that method we're going to call public boolean remove random. And it won't take any parameters, because if you want me to remove a random element from inside the bag, you don't have to tell me any more information to do that. So what I'm going to do is I can kind of look at my other remove methods to think about how I want to implement this method. So what I want to do is I want to pick a random element from our bag. So in ArrayBag, we've stored all of our elements inside of an array, and our array starts at position 0, and the last entry in our array is at position number of entries -1, right? Because if there are 5 elements in our bag, they're stored in array positions 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, okay? So what we need to do is we need to get a random number to represent a random position in our array. So we're going to use the Java provided class called random to create a new object. I'm going to call it generator. And this is in the java.util package, so I need to import that. And then I can get a new random number. I'll call it random position by using the nextInt method, the version that takes in a parameter. Now, the version of this method that takes a parameter, that parameter specifies the number of options that we have for our random number. So if I call generator.nextInt with 3, for example, it's going to give me a random number out of the set 0, 1, and 2, because there's 3 options for random numbers there. If I were to send in nextInt and send in 2, it would give me either a 0 or a 1 back, because I have 2 options for a random number. So how many random number options do I want to pick from? Well, I want to pick from number of entries, because that's how many entries are in my bag, and so that's the number of positions I want to choose from. Okay? So this will return to me a random number starting at 0 and going up to and including number of entries -1, which is number of entries options. And that's exactly the positions in my array that I want to randomly select from. So that's great. So now what I need to do, I've got my position that I'm going to remove, and now I need to do what? I need to remove the entry at that position. Now, should I write code directly to do that, or is there a method I can call that does that for me? Well, the method I would need to call would be some sort of remove method, and it would need to take what as a parameter? Would it take an integer, or would it take an object of type t? Well, it'll take an integer, right? Which integer? This one. It'll take random position. Now, my 2 public methods for removing don't take an integer, but my private method that I wrote, remove entry, does. That takes an integer parameter and removes the element at that index. So what I can do is I can now kind of look at this code that I have up here in this remove method for a guide, and I can say, okay, well, the result is going to be the object result is going to be the result of invoking remove entry, sending in a random position, and then what do I return? Well, I don't have anything to compare it to, so actually I don't care what remove entry returns to me this time, right? Because I know that this position is always going to be valid. If I look back at my remove entry helper method, the only way that that I could have a null return to me is if this if statement is never executed, right? So result is never changed. And this is never going to be executed if the if statement will not be executed if my bag is empty, so that's one way I won't get into the if, or if the index is invalid. Well, I know my index is always going to be valid, right, because I've selected it from my valid positions, right? I only have number of entries, things in my bag, and I've selected a position of one of those things. So I know that my index is always going to be valid. But is there another way that this might return to me a null? Well, the only other way that could happen is if my bag is empty, right? So if I try to remove something random from the bag, but there's nothing in the bag, I have nothing to remove. So what I could do, two things to do that. I could check to see if I can put back in my reference to result, and I could check to see if that's null. So if result equals null, then my remove was failed, I return false. And if it's not null, then I return true. So that's one thing I could do. The other thing I could do is I could just check to see if the bag is empty before I even do any of this code, like this. If the bag is empty, I return false right there. And otherwise, then I go ahead and do all of this code. Either one of those will work. Both are acceptable designs. I'll leave this code in there for now, but the other approach works as well. Note one thing here, that if you know you are comparing something to null, it's not uncommon to see the double equal sign. It's more common to see it that way actually than to see this. You won't see that very often, comparing things with the equals method to null. Both are correct. The reason that we don't see this is because null is not an object, right? So this is actually, it's very uncommon to see that. If you're comparing something directly to null, the typical way to do it is to compare it through the double equal sign, because here we aren't really checking whether result is, quote, the same as null in terms of comparing attributes of an object, because null doesn't have any attributes. We really just want to know if this result has anything in it, if it's a valid object reference at all. And so to do that, we can compare whether it's equal to null using the double equal sign. All right, so now we've added a removeRandom method to our class. So we have a third way of removing things if we have an ArrayBag. The next method we're going to add is an equals method. So we're going to add an equals method to our ArrayBag class, and that equals method will override the equals method from the object class. So we're going to use our @override tag. And it has the method header public boolean equals, taking in one parameter of type object. Remember that the equals method has to have this exact method header. So the first thing I want to know is I want to know if you are sending me an instance of the ArrayBag class. Because if you're not, I can tell you that whatever you are sending me is not equal to my current ArrayBag. So if you're giving me something else, if you're giving me an array list, or if you're giving me, some other collection, or if you're giving me a student, well, it's not going to be equal. So if whatever you're giving me is not an instance of ArrayBag, well, I can tell you right now it's not going to be equal to my current object. But if you are giving me an instance of ArrayBag, well, now I need to do a little investigation to determine if my ArrayBag is the same as your ArrayBag. And it makes sense to think about these two ArrayBags will be the same if they have the same contents. But remember, they don't have to be in the same order in the underlying array, because ArrayBags don't care about order. So if one ArrayBag holds 1, 2, 3, and the other ArrayBag holds 3, 2, 1, those ArrayBags should be equal, right? Because they have the same contents, because we don't care about order in our ArrayBags. So the first thing I need to do when I'm trying to compare these ArrayBags is right now I have an object, but that object doesn't allow me to look at any of the underlying characteristics of an ArrayBag. So what I need to do is I need to cast my ArrayBag to type ArrayBag. And I'll do it using generics. So actually what I should, back up a second. I'll do it using generics so that I'm actually casting it to an ArrayBag that holds elements of type T. So now I have my other ArrayBag that I can compare to my current ArrayBag. Okay, so how can I do this? Well, I essentially need to compare the underlying arrays, right? Because that's what's storing the objects in my bag, and so that's what I need to be comparing. So what I could do is I could get the array of each bag and compare those arrays, right? But in order to compare the arrays, again, they might be in different orders. So ArrayBag 1 might hold this array, have that underlying array for its bag, and other ArrayBag might have this, and those two arrays in this example should be considered equal, right? Because in my bag, I don't care about order. So what I need to do is I need to somehow be able to compare these without caring about the order, okay? So what I can do is this. I don't want to alter either one of my arrays because the equals method shouldn't make any changes to an object. It should just tell you whether two objects are equal or not. So what I want to do is I want to make two temporary arrays. So let me back up one step there, sorry. I want to make two temporary arrays to hold the contents, and then those two temporary arrays I can go ahead and manipulate a little bit and not care about changing the underlying data structure, the underlying bag array that I'm using to represent my object. So I'm going to use my toArray method that I've already written here, which we know returns a newly allocated array of all the entries. So I'm going to use that method and say, all right, well, give me the current bag temp array. Give me a new array that represents the contents of my current bag. And give me a new array that represents the contents of my other bag. Okay. And now these are two newly allocated arrays, which means I can go ahead and change them any way I want, and I'm not changing the underlying bag of either object. So I create new arrays so that I can manipulate them, and it will not alter this .bag, which is the current array, or the other array bag.bag, which is the array representing the other object. So now one thing I could do is I could just sort these arrays. And then if they're sorted, then I can go through and compare object by object. And if each object is the same, then by the time I get to the end of the array, I'm good to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort them. And I have to import the arrays class from java.util. Okay. And now I want to loop through. Let's say I will loop through up to what? Number of entries. If I'm going to loop through my current array, my current bag rather. And I can say, okay, well, if at any point in this loop, if the current bag temp array at position I is not equal to the other bag temp array at position I, then that means I've found a mismatch, and if that happens at any point, I can return false. If I get through that entire loop and I haven't found anything that isn't equal, well, then I can return true because I've searched through both arrays, and at every element I've sorted the arrays and then searched through both of them, and at every point in the comparison, the entry in my current bag was equal to the entry in my other bag. So by the time I get to the end of the arrays, everything I've looked at has been equal, so I can return true, meaning that those bags contain the same entries. Now this uses, again, the equals method. This is the equals method invoked from what class? This is the equals method of the T class, whatever T is. So if T is student, this is the equals method of the student class, which compares two students. If T is integer, this is the equals method of the integer class, which compares two integers, for example. Now, there's only one little mistake in my method here, and has anyone spotted it? Well, let's look at the short example I was thinking about before. If my original bag held 1, 2, 3, and my other bag that you sent me held 3, 2, 1, well, this line here would sort them both, so it would take this temporary copy of the second array and sort it to be this. And now this array is going to go through and compare 1 to 1, they're equal, 2 to 2, they're equal, 3 to 3, they're equal. I've gotten outside the for loop, and I could just return true. If this one contained that, for example, after we did the sort, it would now contain this. And then my loop would compare 1 to 1, they're equal. Would then compare 2 to 3, they're not equal, so it would return false, so that's going to work. But what about if I go back to that first example where the contents were the same originally, where it was, 3 to 1. And what if my first array, or my second array rather, was 3, 2, 1, 4? What if I was comparing these two array bags? Well, after the execution of the sorts, this would now hold 1, 2, 3, 4. And now in my loop, since I loop through based on number of entries, which is the size of my current bag, it's going to compare 1 to 1 equal, 2 to 2 equal, 3 to 3 equal. Now I'm done looking through this array. I've exited, I've returned true, but obviously these two array bags are not the same. So I need to add one more conditional check in here, and I can actually add it right before I do any of this creating my temporary arrays. What I can just do is I can just check if number of entries is equal to other array bag dot number of entries. So basically, if they're the same size, then I can go ahead and do all this stuff, checking the contents. But if they're not the same size, then I don't care what they contain. They're not the same. So I can just add another false, return false there. Okay, so here's my equals method. Again, the first thing I do is I check to see that you've given me an array bag. If you haven't, they're not equal. But if you have, I'll cast it to be that type. And then if you have given me an array bag, the first thing I do is see if they have the same number of things in the bag. If they haven't, they're not equal. But if they do have the same number of things in the bag, then I need to actually compare what's in there. So then I get these temporary copies of my arrays, I sort them, and then I just go through entry by entry, comparing each entry in the array. And as soon as I find a mismatch, not equal. But if I get through looking through the entire array and I've never found a mismatch, then that means I can go ahead and return true. Now, one other note about this equals method is, again, I have multiple return statements in there. Some people do not like the style of programming. Some people would prefer you to use a Boolean variable, like is equal or something like that. And at each point, instead of having a return statement here, you would set is equal to false or to true, and then just have one return statement of this variable at the end of the method. That is a great way to program. It's totally a matter of preference. Some people prefer this way, some people prefer this way. I don't require you to use either way for our class. One good idea is to be consistent in your general approach to programming. So if you have a preference for one way, choose that preference and stick with it. It's better practice to do that than to have some methods use one way and some methods use another way. But the reason some people don't like this stems from some aspects of languages that don't apply to Java. So it's kind of a holdover from previous other languages that people used to use. We can get into a more detailed discussion of that on the boards if you'd like. But anyways, I just want to make note of that either approach is completely acceptable for this class. Okay, so now we've got our equals method. And note again, this equals method would work perfectly fine in the resizable array bag class because it doesn't matter if two resizable array bags are being compared to each other. The way this is written, it wouldn't matter what their capacities were. It only matters what their contents are. If you decided that two resizable array bags are only equal if they have the same capacity, you'd have to alter this method to reflect that. All right, the last method we're going to add into our class here is a method to create a resizable array bag from a given array bag. So let's say you're working with an array bag and you suddenly realize, oh, it's getting kind of full. You know, I really shouldn't have used ArrayBag to write my solution as a client. I really should have used resizable array bag. So how can I get a new object of type resizable array bag, but I want it to have the contents that it has now? So I want a method to send back a resizable array bag of type T from my current array bag. So I'll maybe call it create, or maybe I'll call it, I'll call it create resizable array. And I don't need any parameters to do that, right? I can just, you don't need to give me any more information for me to be able to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look back at my resizable array constructors, the way I can create a resizable array, and I can do it sending in no parameters. I can do it sending in a capacity, but I also have this third overloaded constructor that allows me to create a resizable array bag from a given array. So that might work. So what I can do to send you back a new resizable array bag object is I can say, okay, well, let me get my current bag contents by using the toArray method. And then let me create a new resizable array bag of type T using that constructor. And that's what I'll send you back. So this is a short little method, but it's an example of using existing methods to accomplish a task. So I could have created an empty resizable array bag and then cycled through my current bag array, picking out each element and adding it to my new resizable array bag. But by just taking a look at that class and seeing what methods and constructors are available to me, I can have one line of code to use that existing constructor and create a whole new resizable array bag and then return that to the client. Okay, so here are 3 methods added to this ArrayBag class. These methods will be in the version of the code that I post on Insight. And this is, hopefully seeing this example in the homework, I've asked you to add some methods to this class. And hopefully in seeing this, you realize that you really have to understand the existing code that's there before you can add to it. So make sure you understand all of these existing methods and understand the instance data that you're provided, because you really have to have a good understanding of how that works before you can manipulate it and be able to use that instance data, use those existing methods, including the private helper methods, in order to add new functionality to your class. So when we wrote removeRandom, for example, it was really important for me to understand the removeEntry method, including what it returned, to know how to use that method and how to use what gets returned from it to accomplish my task. So make sure you understand the methods that are there before you go ahead and add new methods. And if you have questions about any of that, as always, please post them online.